When a billionaire father used money and lies to steal full custody of his black son, the court expected silence. But the boy was secretly preparing, reading law books instead of comics, carrying the truth in a school notebook. And when he stood up and said, "I'm my mother's lawyer," the courtroom would never be the same. What happened next will blow your mind. The courtroom wasn't built for children. The chairs were too tall, the silence too heavy, the air full of suits, whispers, and people who thought they already knew how this would end. Then came a voice that didn't belong, and yet changed everything. "I'm my mother's lawyer." Every head turned. Even Judge Whitaker, who'd spent 3 decades behind a bench, lowered his glasses and blinked. Standing beside his mother, in a wrinkled dress shirt and scuffed sneakers, was Elijah Carter, 9 years old, thin as a twig, but with a stare that didn't flinch. Across the courtroom, his biological father, Charles Langford III, nearly spilled his designer coffee. The same man who hadn't shown up for birthdays or phone calls was suddenly trying to win full custody in a $1 million case. "Son," the judge said cautiously, "this is a legal matter for adults." "I understand, Your Honor," Elijah said, lifting a tattered notebook from his backpack. "But according to Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, I have the right to speak in decisions that affect me directly." The room went still. No one was prepared for a child quoting international law, least of all the 2 high-powered lawyers sitting next to Charles, who now looked like they'd walked into the wrong trial. Elijah adjusted his glasses. His voice was calm, too calm for a boy whose life was being torn in half. "And this case affects me more than anyone else in this room." Beside him, his mother, Naomi, looked torn between fear and awe. She had raised Elijah alone, working double shifts at the hospital, missing meals so he could eat, tucking him into bed between night shifts. And now, her son was standing in a courtroom, facing down a man who'd vanished for 9 years, and was now here to claim rights he'd never earned. "Objection!" barked Charles's attorney, Mr. Granger, straightening his tie. "The child has no standing." "If standing means being heard," Elijah replied, "then I stand for both of us." The words were like thunder. Even the stenographer looked up from her keys. Elijah took a deep breath, the kind that adults do before jumping off cliffs, and opened his notebook. The cover was worn, creased at the edges, and filled with pencil marks and tiny post-its. But inside was everything. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady like a lawyer twice his age, "I prepared a presentation on why I want to stay with my mother. It includes facts, legal rights, and motives." That last word, motives, landed like a gavel strike. His father, Charles Langford, shifted in his leather chair, a man who wore $1,000 suits, but never once remembered his son's favorite color. For years, he had ghosted Elijah's life. Now he wanted to rewrite it with lawyers, courtrooms, and a clean image for the press. But the boy, he had done something no one expected. He'd been watching. And more than that, he'd been preparing. For the last 90 days, Elijah had spent every Tuesday and Thursday at the Southside Community Library. While kids his age played video games or watched cartoons, Elijah was reading case law, child rights handbooks, and family court precedents. The librarian, Miss Reynolds, had noticed. She thought it was cute at first, until she realized Elijah wasn't playing pretend. He was studying to save his life. "Your Honor," Elijah continued, turning a page, "my father's lawyer said he wants custody out of concern. But I've done some research. May I share what I found?" Judge Whitaker narrowed his eyes, but nodded. Charles leaned forward, whispering furiously to his lawyer. Elijah flipped a page. 2 weeks after my father visited our apartment, for 15 minutes, he filed for custody. That visit wasn't for me. It was to inspect our furniture and complain about the smell of hospital disinfectant. He called me a bright investment, not a son. The courtroom murmured. "Objection!" Granger shouted. "This is speculative, Your Honor." "Not when it's documented," Elijah replied. He opened a folder from his bag, neatly sorted with color tabs. "I have court filings, business documents, and news articles. I discovered my father lost a $3 million civil suit last year. His third wife filed for divorce last month. And I found the terms of my late grandmother's trust fund. Charles's face drained of color. The trust fund. The real reason he was in this courtroom. Elijah adjusted his glasses again. Not for nerves, but with the practiced poise of someone who knew he held the truth. The fund has $1.7 million. It releases only if my father gains full legal custody. If not, it goes to me when I turn 18, with zero parental access. Gasps rippled through the room. Elijah let the silence hang for just long enough before closing the folder. So the question is simple. Why does a man who ignored me for 9 years suddenly want to be my father? The courtroom fell into a stunned, breathless pause. Even the judge leaned back slowly, as if trying to absorb the weight of the moment. Naomi clutched her coat tighter, eyes wide. She had known her son was smart, but not like this. Not warrior smart. Not battle in the blood smart. The silence in the courtroom felt thick, like a storm building beneath polished floors and mahogany desks. Elijah stood motionless, notebook in one hand, folder in the other, staring at a man he barely recognized and yet shared DNA with. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "before we go any further, there's one more piece of evidence I'd like to submit." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small black device, a voice recorder, scratched but functional. This was recorded 6 months ago. My father thought I was in my room doing homework. I left this on the coffee table just after he told me I might have potential. What he didn't know was that he was about to tell someone else exactly what he really thought. Charles's lawyer, Mr. Granger, stood abruptly. "Objection! This is a private conversation." With a child present in his own home, Judge Whitaker interrupted. "Overruled. Let's hear it." The click of the playback button sounded louder than expected, and then Charles's voice filled the room. "Once I get custody, the kid goes straight to Riverside Military Academy. Strict boarding, 0 distractions. He'll stay there until 18. I'll have full access to the inheritance for educational use. He doesn't even need to know it exists." Naomi gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth. She hadn't known. The courtroom rippled. The clerk stopped typing. Even the bailiff shifted his weight uncomfortably. Then came the second voice. "Exactly. $500 a month for tuition. The rest's mine. It's perfect. She's out, I'm in, and I still look like Father of the Year." Elijah turned the recorder off. Slowly, deliberately, and when he looked up, Charles Langford was pale, sweat pooling at his collar. He'd been caught, not by a lawyer, not by a journalist, but by a child. This is a trap. Charles barked, standing. "He provoked me. This is manipulation. A 9-year-old provoke you into revealing financial fraud?" Judge Whitaker's tone was cold now. Granger tried to regain control. "Even if this conversation is real, it doesn't prove that Mr. Langford isn't capable of providing what?" Elijah cut in, his voice steel beneath skin. "Isolation? A prison disguised as a school? A vault to drain my inheritance while locking me away?" He opened to the final section of his notebook. "Riverside Military Academy has had 3 student suicides in the last 5 years. It's under federal investigation for abuse." I printed the report, and the tuition my father quoted doesn't match the actual rates, which means he never planned to spend the money on my education at all. Charles collapsed back into his chair. Granger was speechless. "My grandmother didn't just leave me a fund," Elijah said quietly. "She left me instructions. A letter. It said, 'If he ever tries to take you just to reach this money, fight back. And know that I believed in you before you even knew who you were.'" A full silence fell. Not the awkward kind, but the sacred kind. The kind that only truth can bring. Judge Whitaker removed his glasses slowly, the silence stretching long and heavy. Not out of confusion, but because what he'd witnessed was unlike anything he'd ever seen. A boy, barely tall enough to see over the table, had just out-argued 2 seasoned lawyers and exposed a custody fraud so cold it stunned the court into stillness. "Young man," the judge said, his voice softer now, "you've demonstrated clarity, composure, and courage that most adults can only dream of." He turned to Charles. "Mr. Langford, the court finds your motive manipulative, dishonest, and financially exploitative. Your petition for custody is not only denied, I'm ordering an investigation into potential trust fund misappropriation attempts. Charles opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time, he looked powerless, stripped of his wealth, his ego, and most painfully, his performance. Judge Whitaker looked back at Elijah. Do you understand the weight of what you've done here today? Elijah nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I wasn't trying to win. I just didn't want to disappear. The judge's eyes glistened for a brief second. He cleared his throat and tapped the gavel once. This case is closed. Legal custody remains with Ms. Naomi Carter. And young Elijah, he paused, if you ever decide to become a lawyer, you already have your first victory. The courtroom broke into soft applause, even from the press box. Not because they were instructed to, but because something real had happened. Something rare. Not a show, not a spectacle, but a revolution in a child's voice. Outside the courthouse, Naomi wrapped Elijah in her arms. Her hands trembled as they held him, not out of fear, but out of overwhelming pride. You saved us, she whispered. But Elijah pulled back, eyes fierce but kind. No, Mama, you saved me every day. I just gave it back. Across the street, journalists tried to get photos. News vans had begun to roll in, but Naomi shielded her son, ushering him gently through the crowd. Let's go home. And they did. Days later, the story had already gone viral. Boy lawyer shuts down custody scheme. 9-year-old delivers courtroom bombshell. Truth has no age. Elijah Carter's case sparks nationwide reform. Law professors quoted him. Activists praised him. Even state representatives introduced a new bill, Elijah's Law, ensuring every minor has a right to speak in court during family litigation, if they choose. But none of that mattered to Elijah. He didn't want fame. He didn't want headlines. He just wanted his mother, his home, his truth. The room no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a moment carved in time, the kind people tell their children about. A boy, no taller than the witness stand, had stood up not just for himself, but for every child who had ever been spoken over, ignored, or used as a pawn. Judge Whitaker sat still, glasses resting at the end of his nose. His fingers drummed lightly on the bench, his expression unreadable, but his silence was thunderous. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who knew the system had just been challenged by its smallest defendant. Elijah, he said, looking directly at the boy, you've done something today that no one expected. Not this courtroom, not your father, maybe not even your mother. You've stood up with clarity, truth, and evidence that many adults, even trained attorneys, fail to provide. The judge turned his eyes toward Charles Langford, whose posture now sagged under the fluorescent lights, sweat tracing the lines on his forehead. Gone was the smug billionaire image. All that remained was a man exposed, not by investigation, but by a 9-year-old with a voice recorder and a notebook. Mr. Langford, Judge Whitaker continued, the court finds that your intent in filing for custody was financially motivated, not emotionally, not ethically, not in the interest of the child's well-being, but in pursuit of access to inherited wealth. Therefore, your petition for full custody is not only denied, but your access to Elijah will now be supervised, pending a formal investigation into fraudulent misrepresentation and financial manipulation. A murmur echoed through the room like a wave of release. Even Charles's attorney, Mr. Granger, sank slightly, as if the performance they had prepared for weeks had suddenly collapsed under the weight of truth. But Elijah didn't smile. He simply stood there, arms hanging by his sides, eyes steady, the same boy who'd once been told he talked too much, fidgeted too much, asked too many questions. And yet today, he had just rewritten an entire narrative. The judge leaned forward again. Young man, do you understand what you've done here? Elijah nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I understand that grown-ups don't always listen, and sometimes you have to show them why they should. Judge Whitaker's face softened, his voice quieter now. Have you considered becoming a lawyer? I don't know yet. Elijah shrugged, but I know I'll keep fighting. For her. He looked at his mother, Naomi Carter, whose face was streaked with silent tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her coat, trying to hold together the heart that had nearly shattered so many times. She had raised Elijah alone, through shifts that bled into mornings, skipped meals, and cold apartments where the only warmth came from their laughter. She had taught him how to love, how to think. But this bravery, she hadn't taught him that. He had taught her. When the judge tapped the gavel once, the room didn't erupt. It exhaled, like it had been holding its breath since Elijah first stood up and said, "I'm my mother's lawyer." Case closed. Custody officially granted to Naomi Carter. Access restricted. Supervised only. Financial control transferred to Elijah under third-party trust. Outside, the media had already gathered. Journalists shouted his name. Cameras flashed. Microphones reached past security lines. "Elijah, Elijah, can we talk to you? How did you learn all that legal language? What do you want to be when you grow up?" He didn't stop, didn't wave, didn't pose. He just grabbed his mother's hand. "Mama," he whispered, "let's go home." They walked past the cameras, past the reporters, past the man who tried to buy his place in Elijah's life with nothing but lies and inheritance. The only thing Elijah carried now was his old backpack and the quiet power of being heard. 2 days later, the headlines exploded. The boy who outlawyered a billionaire. 9-year-old dismantles custody scam in courtroom showdown. Elijah's law gains momentum across states, yes. That's what they were calling it now. Elijah's Law, a policy proposal requiring family courts to provide every child, regardless of age, the opportunity to speak directly in any custody case that affects them. Because sometimes, one senator said in a televised debate, children aren't just the subject of a case. They are the truth inside it. But back in the Carter apartment, Elijah wasn't watching the news. He wasn't interested in headlines or fame. He was sitting at the small kitchen table, coloring with a broken crayon beside his mother. The old radio played jazz in the background. The night was quiet. "Safe, you okay?" Naomi asked gently, brushing his curls with her fingers. "I am now," he whispered. "Are you?" She didn't answer right away. She just leaned down and kissed the top of his head. "I've always been okay because I had you." And for the first time in a long time, Elijah didn't feel like a child in a war zone. He felt like a son in a home he'd just protected with more courage than most men ever find. They say the court is a place of rules, of structure, of order. But sometimes a single voice, soft, untrained, and unexpected, can shake the foundations of an entire system. Elijah Carter didn't walk into that courtroom to win. He walked in to be heard. And in doing so, he reminded the world of something it keeps forgetting. Truth doesn't need a degree. Courage doesn't ask for permission. And justice doesn't always wear a tie. Across the country, conversations began to shift. Teachers who once ignored the loud kids started listening. Judges reconsidered how they viewed children in custody hearings. Parents, broken by battles and silence, felt a new sense of hope. Because Elijah's story wasn't just a legal win. It was a mirror for every courtroom that forgot who it was really built to protect. A mirror for every father who thought love was a performance. A mirror for every system that mistook silence for consent. Months later, Elijah stood on a small stage at his school's Youth Voices assembly. His jeans were faded, his shirt untucked. But when he spoke, the room leaned in. "If you ever feel like no one hears you," he said softly, "don't stop talking. Even if your voice shakes, say it anyway. Because sometimes the smallest voice carries the biggest truth." The crowd stood before he even finished. Because they weren't clapping for a kid. They were clapping for a revolution. One that came in sneakers, with a backpack full of borrowed books and a recorder from a thrift store in a world that told him to stay quiet. He spoke. In a courtroom built to drown him out, he rose. And when they tried to use money to rewrite his story, he wrote his own chapter, in ink, not fear, because Elijah Carter didn't just win a case. He taught us that the truth doesn't care how old you are. It only needs you to stand.